Is your company data on dark web? And the webinar is brought to you by Nord Security, one of the world's leading cybersecurity solution providers. And obviously, we have an interesting topic to talk about today. 93% of CISOs are concerned about dark web threats, but are security leaders leveraging dark web monitoring to spot data leaks before they actually escalate? Today, we'll focus on the dark web and the challenges security leaders face because of it. So we'll explore how to assess your business exposure and share some recommendations for the leaders when it comes to mitigating dark web threats and securing sensitive business data. So I'm very excited to actually introduce you to the panel industry leaders, the panel discussion we're going to have today that are joining me here. So we have Vladimir Krupnov, Threat Intelligence Lead at Revolut. We have Andrew Rose, Chief Security Officer at SoSafe, and Matt Lee, Senior Director of Security and Compliance at Pax8. So to set the stage, perhaps you could briefly introduce yourself, guys. Vladimir, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. So my name is Vladimir Krupnov. I've been leading a threat intelligence team at Revolut for the past 5 years. And before that, I worked for 3 years in a company called Digital Shadows, now it's ReliQuest, and role of security consultant.
Okay, I'll go next. So Andrew Rose, I'm Chief Security Officer at SoSafe, but I've actually been a CISO for many, many years in lots of different organizations. So I was CISO for UK Air Traffic Control, CISO for MasterCard in the UK, CISO for 2 of the biggest global law firms. And I also spent about 5 years as an analyst for Forrester Research as well.
I'm little old me. I'm Matt Lee. I'm Senior Director of Security and Compliance at Pax8. I serve a predominantly external role in education and working in either subject matter work or working directly with MSP service providers, providing to the small to mid-sized business market predominantly. So great to be here. Appreciate it.
Awesome. As you can see, we are in great hands with the experts here today. And if you have any questions, don't forget to drop those down in the question box and we'll look to address those as we go or address those at the end of the webinar. But let's dive into it. And let's start with the foundation, with the fundamentals. We keep on hearing about dark web, and especially it's everywhere in the media. We're talking about dark web today, but perhaps let's address what is dark web. And Matt Lee, maybe you can actually get us started here on a quick one-on-one to understand better what's dark web.
Yeah, I mean, at its core, the dark web, or Tor as it's first started, or the Onion Routing Project, started in the mid-90s by the U.S. Naval Research Lab and scientists Michael Reed, David Goldschlag, and Paul Syverson as a mathematician to try to make it to where, even though I might still be tracked, they won't be able to track it back to me. It was an intention of trying to solve anonymity of the U.S. intelligence service, of sharing information when they're using unfriendly resources, ultimately, right? As the ability to transmit data in a way that it's not known where those origins came from. And at its principal core, it uses these onion routers that allow you to have other exit nodes, exit points, than where you actually started, making traceability of that action a little harder from that perspective. So over-summarizing, but ultimately, it's the place where data has been traded. It's the place where threat actors have set up their sites to try to obfuscate where the actual infrastructure is living. And at the end of the day, it's where a lot of the business has historically been transmitted and dealt with from that perspective. And I know, Vlad, you had some thoughts and kind of talked about how this is changing. Dark web used to just mean onion sites, but it means a lot of different stuff now, doesn't it, brother?
Yeah, I think once it comes to Tor browser, when it became so widespread, actually I've heard some stories that eventually they realized that they were the only one using this technology, and it could have been easily fingerprinted. So you just need to spread it around and then to cover some traces. Yeah, but I feel like nowadays dark web it's being perceived as sort of like a magic nanny doll where all the threats are, where people are talking about your company. Yeah. And generally, for my definition, I would say it's a cyberspace where the criminals or potential criminals gather and do some communications, so do some malicious activity, which could be related to your company or government or anything else. Just to give you a pure statistics, let's see, 95% of the incidents which I've seen come from the clear web, from non-onion websites.
Sure.
Obviously, it depends on your company threat profile and then on bits and pieces, but generally, dark web is not just all about the Tor. It's way more than that. It can start from credentials leakage to access brokers to some, in developing countries, some groups are using WhatsApp coordinate some things.
Telegram or all these other things.
Yeah, it's very, very broad, especially with the development of the messenger ecosystems where, they do allow some extra functionality and everything. Like Telegram is a great example here. Dark web became way more broader term.
Agreed. You also said something else I wanted to point out too, which is you talked about criminals and potential criminals or threat actors and potential threat actors. There's another category that hang out there too. They're the yous of the world, right? At the end of the day, oftentimes the same watering hole that's filled with the poison of dark web is also filled with threat researchers and my friends, right? That go and look for those creds and help tell those things. Andrew, what are your thoughts on that? Dark web in general, I suppose.
I guess it is. I mean, being a CISO, I'm not as technical as you guys, but what I see from my CISO colleagues is the fact that they have to embrace some of this for some of the people who work in their environments. So certainly in newspapers and media, they tend to have, dark web drop sites, and they tend to have journalists that use all this anonymization technique to spread stories from oppressive regimes and to get that news out of those areas that don't want this data to come out and cover up the sources, etc. So although a lot of the conversation so far has been about all the criminal intent and the malicious purposes behind all this, we do need to think that there are benefits that come out of this as well, such as the Arab Spring, when all that information came out and it enabled the dissidents to fight against oppressive regimes and avoid government monitoring. So I think there is benefit to this as well, but it's well hidden under all of the morass of terribleness that's in there, I guess. But there are benefits, and that makes a CISO's job a little bit more difficult because you have to sort of embrace the dark web as well as fear it, because you realize that it might be serving your business as well as, endangering your business as well, which is a little bit.
Absolutely. And I think these are all great points, because I think the big sort of negative connotation of that around dark web for everyone is that pretty much what you guys said as well. It's scary, it's illegal. That's where the hackers go as well, thieves, you name it, right? But that's a concern for cybersecurity professionals themselves, to make sure that to understand it, you need to be able to utilize it as well. So how does understanding the dark web and the true nature of the dark web can help cybersecurity leaders to actually protect their organizations? Well, how would that play into it? Andrew, you mentioned that obviously we need to understand it. We need to utilize it and sort of use it to our own advantage. That's what you mentioned, Matt Lee, as well. How do we do that? How do we understand dark web beyond the traditional connotations?
I'll give a great example where it might matter. Think about during an incident, in an incident response. I might stand up a WhatsApp channel that's meant to be ephemeral, that's only going to live for that communication structure out of band, and then want it to be gone. Why? Because I don't want everybody to be able to discover it necessarily. I might want it to be in a place that isn't in my normal comms structure, so I can maybe control the discoverability of it. So what you have to think about is, what is the dark web? Dark web is a methodology of creating end-to-end encrypted technologies or end-to-end encrypted communications that add a degree of anonymity and ephemerality to it to some extent, right? That's essentially what I would codify dark web as. And so one of my thoughts are, it's better to understand the components of what it is so that you understand what it is, and then you understand your use cases where it applies to you too. Andrew, you look like you're itching to say something, so I can
only because
back off.
I've got to bring the CISO perspective to that, and
please.
I completely appreciate your sort of need to create a non-discoverable communications channel. The ex-lawyer CISO in me, my blood runs cold hearing that, really, because that's exactly what you're not meant to do. If you're going to have communications, they have to be discoverable so you can prove you did the right thing at the end of it. But I think Americans have that perspective on data.
Maybe there's a bit of misspeaking here. So I think I'm glad you brought this up. What I mean by that is, I have let's say I use Exigence, right? Noam Morgenstern's platform out of the UK. There is a component where I'm establishing a new semi-ephemeral, and that would be discoverable only to the part of what was discussed there, not including the rest of my systems in that discoverability, if that makes sense. So you great clarification.
But I think it's important because we all know that if you get a breach on your network, then the first thing you can't trust is your communications.
Yeah, so, true story.
So there's a hacker on your network, therefore I can't use email. Therefore, how the hell do I talk to everybody?
Right.
So having that outer band way of communication is very important. And you see that a lot in sort of the exec levels. They all sit back on WhatsApp or Signal or Telegram or something and use those channels just in case the initial channel is compromised.
I think in terms of the new hacking groups, they're not trying to hide, right? Like if you take ransomware groups, hey guys, ransom this. Take groups like Lapsus. There are quite a few of similar ones operating right now. They seek publicity, right? They seek kind of respect, and it's not about if you try to collect from dark web, you shouldn't set your ultimate goal of intercepting some encrypted Jabber servers or custom messaging or anything like that. It can go as simple as you just go into Google and put your company name and just put something like buy credentials. And you might find what you want, right? It's still going to be dark web from executive perspective, at least from my experience. Well, in fact, it's not dark web. Anyone can access it. Or let's take Telegram. Put in Telegram something like carding channel. You will find thousands of groups. None of them get deleted. It's freedom of speech, right? Which you touched before. So there is like another shadow to that. And I think that's a massive problem because eventually it just lowers the barrier of that typical person to become a cyber criminal. It's fair. It just takes 2 clicks nowadays.
Yeah, and I think that's what I like it to be slightly more elaborated on as well. I actually saw that firsthand personally, where the surface web attacks and information available through the surface web itself, it's actually so sophisticated, so scary, you don't even need dark web. So perhaps we could slightly elaborate as well the difference in sophistication. And we're talking about encryption and dark web, but obviously, Vladimir, you mentioned all the time, that you don't need to necessarily go to dark web to access the information. Right. The companies should be aware of that also, and security leaders.
Well, what is that information? Let's start there. Let's make this a little more simple. The information that I steal from your network will be likely passwords in an info stealer type methodology, right? Things that I might gather like redline malware, other things that allow me to gather that kind of information. It might be things like intellectual property. It might be files. It might be different things in that regard. And so the stuff that Vladimir was talking about that I can go search for or that I can find easily is being traded for dollars, right? If I'm an initial access broker and I've gained access into one of Andrew's companies, then I either do potentially have access to my own in-house method to monetize that, or I don't. And I'm going to go sell that to someone that's going to monetize that, right? So if it's an access to a certain company, we've seen the Telegram notices, Vlad, you live in this more than me, of, hey, I've got access to 100 VMware servers in Kansas City. Does anybody want to go halvesies on me? And let's go ahead and do a ransomware affiliate program, right? And then they reach out to an affiliate, they work with that.
So, Matt, quick one. So all of that happens on dark web, right?
Ish. I mean, that's what Vladimir was just saying, is it's turned into Telegram channels and other types of definitions, not just some site or service on the dark web. Yep. This has moved into other services. But in some form or fashion, yes, they're going to sell what they have obtained, or they are going to act upon what they have obtained. Or in other cases, they're different actors with different motives, and they're maybe
ideally a company would be using some sort of tool to be able to track that and see when that happens. But from CISO's perspective, Andrew, how would you go about that if you see something like that happening in your organization, or would you see if that is happening in your organization? How do you tackle to avoid those type of circumstances?
Oh, good Lord. Well, how do I avoid the circumstances of my intellectual property being sold on the dark web? That's a whole hour-long conversation, frankly.
Yes, it is.
There's so many different controls you have to put in place. I do have a question, though, if I could sort of subvert it back to what you were just saying, Matt. You said about how people are now selling this via sort of Telegram and the like, but doesn't that make it more of a risk for the criminal? Because one of the benefits of the dark web was all the difficulty to get into the right groups where you could actually see where this was, and the validation that you'd have to go through to be proven to be one of the gang who could then participate. Right. But if they're making it more accessible via Telegram and all those systems, isn't that then bringing them closer to the surface, bringing them to be more accessible by law enforcement?
I'll push that to Vladimir, and then I'll tackle it if it doesn't hit that. This is more your world, Vladimir.
Yeah, I would say it gets more accessible, but generally to secure the initial access point, it's not some sort of a very hard thing to do. And again, we had the discussion before. Nowadays, anyone can find so many guides or, so many methods or step-by-step guides how to become private, right? And for law enforcement, it's not, you can always find anyone, right? Generally, if you spend enough time and effort, and it all comes to time and effort. Right. So if someone sells the credentials belonging to your company, and let's say the existing damage is less than few millions, then it's very unlikely it's going to be picked up by the law enforcement unless it's a part of the broader campaign. And that's one of the biggest challenges that I see working right now in the financial sector is law enforcement escalation, not to mention the international one, which in some cases are very much of a discovery journey, very unstructured, and very depending on the stakeholder management, but just even the local one, right? I keep being asked by by let's say C-level. Well, okay, they're selling our accounts. Why police don't do, why police don't find them and jail them? Yeah. So then just say, okay, that's the baseline, right? That's the baseline of the work. That's how dirty it is.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'd add to this of saying just exactly what you said, Vlad. I mean, I just watched a talk at DEF CON 33 of a dark web seller explaining the things he went through as he went down that profile. And they would often just burn the profile, Andrew, to the point. He would just say, all right, it's time to burn my PGP key. I'm getting close to me. Next, I'll just build a new profile. And so that's the other part of it. They're living in plain sight. I do it too, though, right? Like I have personas that are my personas that I can burn that exist that are for my purposes. And Vlad, I imagine you do too. So I think they're living in plain sight with false personas from a very well hardened and protected access point to varying degrees of that statement, I suppose. Is that a fair way to put it?
Because it does interest me because I would have thought, and I'm no expert in this, Mark, but I would have thought that they'd want to build up a level of trust regarding that persona so they could be perceived as a trustworthy seller.
They hate burning a persona. It sucks. But yes, they do. Yes.
And I was wondering whether that's changed because I was reading recently about one dark web marketplace who's now currently extorting all of their customers by basically saying, I've got all the dirt on you, all the stuff you bought off me recently, all of the IP addresses, etc. And I'm now going to hand that over to other people unless you pay me loads of money to wipe that. And it's like, it does seem like...
No honor among thieves? This blows my mind, Andrew Rose. I can't believe that's the truism.
How can that be true? That's terrible. Can't trust anybody these days. So
and then to that same point... What's interesting is to that same point, depending on how well as a actor I hardened my own access, I wouldn't care what they were selling about me potentially, right? Depending on what I'm doing. Think about like how many different accounts you could create for various micro functions or things where you're only on this site with this. And I'm getting off into a tangent, but I do think that the tradecraft and OPSEC is better than most people give credit for. And I would also say is probably better than most companies you've led in most cases. It is the risk reward of what they're doing. And since the risk is extremely high, they seem to respond with better OPSEC, better methodologies, things like that. I know, Vladimir, you'd be closer to this data from a threat research perspective than I would be, but I would imagine.
I would say, some of them have good OPSEC, right? But in many cases, you can identify who stands behind it, where the person
from
is.
TTPs,
from TTPs, from correlation between the industry peers of IP addresses and everything, and so on and so on. But then, what you're going to do with that?
I was going to say, how does that help security leader? You find out is that up in any way?
Yeah, it's always kind of like, okay, we find out who it is. What happens next? Okay,
yeah.
Should we inform police, or can we inform them 1 year pass, 2 year pass? So continue. What you should do next? And that's a very interesting question. I think many companies face it who kind of a bit more aggressive and actually get to the stage where they identify the criminals rather than just printing reports and showcasing, hey, we have 5 more actors we track, but we're just tracking them and nothing else we're doing.
The other thing, though, go ahead.
Go ahead, Matt.
The other thing I was going to say is that what really needs to be focused on is what do I do when I do find stuff on the dark web, right? It's going to happen. You're going to have compromisation. I used to have a term called live compromised, that really just said, hey, I know that at any given time, one of my people is probably compromised. How do I limit the blast radius? How do I find it faster? How do I impact it better? And so when I think of dark web monitoring, for me, it's not the value of targeting the threat actor or really even to any extent understanding my threat models, which is true. But really, it's about needing to know that Johnny's stuff's compromised. It's time to dig into Johnny and reset Johnny's stuff and dig into what might have happened and deal with my incident. Like, we just often overlook that part of, I've got to go after the criminal. No, maybe you want to close the door and lock it. Anyways, yeah.
Well, I've got a real life case of that happening in one of my organizations where I used a threat intel firm, and that threat intel firm brought me information about one of the identities of one of our staff members being sold online. And it had all the details about his personal life in terms of banking details, social media passwords, all of that stuff was there. So, we reached out immediately to that staff member and helped them close down all of those loops to make sure that they were secure, because we knew that although it was a personal issue for them, that could very easily turn into an insider threat, could turn into blackmail, could turn into insider risk for us.
All of it.
So we were constantly looking for those sort of those details to see whether we could help our staff protect themselves. And that does happen occasionally.
You brought up a new concept too, because you didn't just say the company stuff. Right. And if you look at it, it's the personal. Look at Dragos's compromisation. They compromised a technician before he got hired on and then rode that train in. Right. You look at the compromisation of from who bought Mandiant, not Mandiant. Anyways, the Cisco Talos write-up of the Cisco breach in 2022. That was some bloke that had his personal creds syncing his work creds to it and got compromised in his personal account. You nailed something, Andrew, of I want to monitor my personal accounts of my employees, not just the business ones, right? There's some risk there too.
Super difficult to do. I mean,
it is.
I work for a German company and they would be horrified by that concept.
Yeah.
Privacy being absolutely paramount, especially in Germany, especially, but across
employee to employer, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we basically, what search terms you use to find the details of all your staff members across the dark web. So we were effectively looking for anything to do with our brand, our company. And it just so happened that part of the details that were being sold said this member
was your company
is working for this 100%. Organization, and this is the role. And so that was our trigger, that was our hook to find that record. And then we could use that as this is why we found it, this is why we're intervening. But it does lead you down a pretty sketchy ethical road, because you look at things like the Ashley Madison data dump.
Yep.
And suddenly we were sat there going, what do we do with this? Do we download this data and look at it to see whether any of our staff are being compromised and are therefore potentially being blackmailed? Or because that's us downloading illegally stolen data? Or do we step away from it and just leave it and ignore it and do the right thing? And just
Sophie's choice, isn't it?
So I won't say what we did in that circumstance, but we took appropriate action, and protected our organization.
There is a way to solve both in my mind, somewhat, in the sense that, like, what Pax8 does is they pay for Aura for every employee, right? And that then is at least asking and informing those employees to self-track. Again, now we're back to this employee must self-track challenge, and then respond to those things. But to your point, it wouldn't give me intelligence about upcoming blackmail for insider threats of saying, hey, I'm going to tell your wife that you were on Ashley Madison meeting with other people if you don't go give this one little computer file inside Andrew's company, right? And that's the challenge with that. It doesn't give you that intelligence, but it does try to move that trust barrier, to your point, down to that employee of giving them the tools they need to find their own dark web problems and challenges there.
I think to level this up, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong. I think the Yahoo breach happened because one of the developers had his personal development server address listed on his long time ago. Address listed on his LinkedIn profile, and then they compromised the server and through their own. And how would you prevent your developers from listing this server on their LinkedIn profile? That's a tough question. Yeah.
And probably the big sort of thing to address here is definitely education, right? We always see that the weak link into any organization is always the user, right? Like every single one of us.
And the strongest link, damn it. But yes.
And the strongest link, right? But then how do you become the strongest link? It's the education, right? So fair enough. If you live and breathe security, like for you guys and for me, we understand the risks and we understand our personal devices that we use as interconnection to the company information and so on. And obviously my personal life needs to be protected. But the big thing here is it's not just dark web or understanding what's happening, seeing those breaches and whatnot, but actually educating the users in our organizations, right? To everyday life.
That's so important. And I think you've used the sort of weakest link and strongest link. And I hate both of those, frankly. I now try to describe users as your primary attack surface.
That's fair.
Sort of what
true story. Exactly. Yep.
So if people are, attacking your staff to try and gain their credentials, to try and leverage them to get into organizations. So education and awareness becomes absolutely paramount. And you see all the data, don't you, from like the Verizon data breach study and World Economic Forum saying that, was it 80, 90% of breaches are all human related? And I think that's true. And yet, what do we spend on the human side of it? 5% of our budget, 10% of our budget at the maximum? And yet, that's
it's often a checkbox exercise.
It really is.
It's often, did you take your training? Great. And when you look at and read, go ahead, Andrew.
I was going to say, I think we educate people about just the surface topics as well, don't we? We tell them about phishing and email. And yet here we are talking about something that, even to me is largely a dark art. So we need to be making the users aware of the threats that come from these sort of environments and doing that in a much more accessible way so they can self-protect and start to assess for themselves using those services you mentioned earlier, whether they've been breached, whether they've got a threat. So even just things like, have I been pawned? People look at that and think, oh, that's a dodgy site. I shouldn't look at that. Perhaps that's a fake website itself. We should be building up people's ability to self-protect themselves in these environments and assess their own risk levels, I think.
You need to start with your onboarding process. Because it's also, the group which is being attacked most frequently are the new joiners, especially if you're going to take the C executive level. Those joiners who are not well aware of the accepted communication channels inside the company, and then they get this call pretending to be their CEO or CTO or whatever, asking, hey, can you please send this email, and so on and so on. And generally, they're the most perceptive group to any training. Because again, let's be frank, if each of us goes through security training every year, eventually just become bored of these 10, 20 modules. You need just to complete all that. You know that, yeah, exactly. So it's very hard to keep the engagement here. While when the person just joins, you set the rules, you set the culture. It's a perfect point where you can inject that type of the security mindset and potentially prevent some significant percentage of the upcoming incidents.
Yeah. There's a question or two questions in the audience from, one is from Vilmonte asking, how do you effectively communicate to executive shareholders and stakeholders the importance of dark web monitoring? I don't know if we want to tackle that. And then there's a second question that seems to be tangential. Andrew, go ahead.
I'll have a quick go at that one because that's the sort of thing, you just have to take stories to your exec. Stories are the thing that works best. So taking examples like this, the story I mentioned earlier about finding the details of a staff member online and being able to protect them, which then protects them from becoming an insider risk. Finding other stories I've got is receiving a phone call from a threat intel provider, letting me know that there was discussions about attacking my sector, and being able to tell us, okay, that threat actor tends to work in this way, and therefore I could adjust my controls and start to change my monitoring to protect the organization. So bringing stories like that to the exec, showing how the threat intel feeds into your control stack and your prioritization and your monitoring to be as effective as possible at the right things at the right time, I think is the way to talk to your exec. It's all about business protection. So show them how the dark web is impacting your control selection to protect your organization and enable business services.
It's basically a threat scenario modeling with some sort of a probability metrics depending on your business, threat posture, the risk appetite. I think 99% of vendors, they're using Verizon data breach report to calculate the probabilities. Yeah, so probably, but I do fully agree with you, Andrew, that it's telling the stories. But generally, intelligence is telling the stories, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I think one of the things I like to say about dark web monitoring is I like to look for ways to reduce the impact of a compromise. What I mean by that is, if you look at the NIST wheel, it says identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Now, obviously, we have governance being added in 2.0, but that's 3/5 of the wheel is after the explosion happens. Why? It's because the most improvement opportunity I have as a leader is once the explosion happens on how much I limit its damage, how much I limit its impact on my business operations and function. And the way to do that is to find it earlier, to detect earlier. Well, one of the ways to do that is to have canaries, right? Both internal in my network as a canary token to find actors when they stumble on my accidental grenade, but also externally. And what kind of canaries can I do externally? Threat data. That's it, right? And so when you start thinking about it, dark web monitoring, threat modeling, threat data, threat intelligence, all of those pieces are my canaries outside my organization, often very literally about what's about to happen to me. Imagine you find this cred right before it's sold from the IAB to the threat actor that's going to ransom in those 3 days. And you can take action and make that cred not any longer valuable, remove the credential, remove the persistence, whatever it may be. Anyways, Andrew, that's my take on it is bringing it into that understanding of other things we already know, like canaries. We understand what a canary is and why it dies in the mine first, right? So anyways.
Absolutely, completely agree.
I think we can address one of the questions as well, which is actually interesting. That's been brought by an anonymous person. What metrics do you use to measure the effectiveness of your organization's dark web monitoring and threat detection capabilities? So how do we measure those metrics?
Those are two separate things asked there, because dark web monitoring effectiveness or efficacy versus threat detection capabilities. Because threat detection capabilities, what is a threat? Let's just do that. Let's play that game. What is a threat? A threat is an action, right? A vulnerability is a way I might get blown up or a way I might get destroyed, but a threat is active, right? A threat at that point is an active piece. Think of it this way. If we're looking at the Death Star, the vulnerability was this giant open shaft. The threat was a bloke in an X-Wing, right? Like at the end of the day. And so when we say threat detection capabilities, we're actually saying now when bad Matt is attacking my organization, can I find it? Can I detect it? That's a different conversation. But the first one is dark web monitoring. So I just wanted to pick apart the words and make sure we're actually talking about the actual conversation. How do you test the effectiveness of my dark web monitoring? For me, it was often about the accuracy of the results, right? If I was getting creds and they were correct, that's pretty accurate. If I was not getting creds, then I have maybe a potential or everything's great. So Vladimir or Andrew, can you tackle the way you handle metrics around dark web monitoring or in general, not just specifically broad threat intelligence, but very specific my intelligence about my organization? Yeah.
I think the only and the most logical measurement you can have is intelligence actionability.
Exactly.
So if the intelligence which is being provided to you by the vendor, it's just interesting, but it's not actionable internally, then you need to make this hard choice. Okay, do you want to keep it? And that's the reason. And the thing that is not actionable because nothing happens, or maybe it's just not the right vendor. Because for every maturity stage of the company, I saw it in Revolut, right? There is a right setup of your intelligence collection. There are different threats and everything. And there is no blue magic pill for everyone that, okay, this vendor, we just cover everything. It's all sort. Maybe from compliance point of view, it would be. But if you're talking the real practice, no, possibly.
That's the thing, right? There's info. What do we do with it, right?
It's an interesting topic because honestly, I never had a metric for this, and it's not something I've really thought about until this question came up. But what I did is I found that a lot of the threat intel that I'd get, especially when I started looking around threat intel vendors, would be really dated, and so they'd bring me stuff which had been up on the dark web for years, and they were trying to sort of impress me by saying, "Look what we found." It's like, yeah, we know about that years ago. So currency was one of the things. How recent was the data they're giving me? But honestly, I found it very difficult to, even when the threat intel was not being terribly good and not being terribly insightful, it was never a service you could do without, because you always knew that next month might be, the big month where suddenly they'd find something which could make this whole contract worthwhile. So I could never really get rid of it, but quite often it went through quite long periods of time where it really wasn't all that valuable. So I didn't have a metric other than just my gut feel about, is this service any good and how recent is the data they're bringing me?
So, which speaks towards actionability, right? From Vladimir's point too.
It does.
Yeah. So
I think it's a good idea, a good metric.
And I think it might be interesting to approach a big question, because a lot of times it's only, well, we have that stigma thinking that it's only the big companies need to be concerned about the dark web. And I know we talked about it, Vladimir, you kind of had a few points around this as well. I think it's interesting to address, why should smaller companies be concerned about it? And I think that's the big stigma that we need to make sure that we address. It's not only the big companies being targeted, right?
Here's the deal. Do you have a dog or a cat, Gerald?
I don't. I wish I did, but
anybody on this call have a dog or a cat or a loved one? Okay. If I steal your dog or cat or loved one, will you pay to get it back? Yes, because you love it.
No, I'm not sponsoring the crime. I'm not sponsoring the crime.
I understand. Well, that's good. You shouldn't. And the dog's done, Vlad. Okay, so the point is, as a small business, if I land on your credential, your data doesn't have to be valuable to me. It doesn't have to be valuable to the world. It only has to matter to you to get you to pay. Yeah. I only have to get you to care. And when you think about it, small to mid-sized business, if I'm landing on a credential and then gaining access to something and then automating a script to do the next step of my ransomware, I don't give a crap who you are. I don't care. As long as you can pay me, there is a threat actor out there for you. Anyways, my take on it.
I don't even think it's that. I think you can be used as part of a sort of train of trust.
That too, as well.
I'm going to hack into you. I'm going to steal your credentials, and I'm then going to use that to contact my real target, which is a business.
True story.
Sell services.
That's Target by definition, right? The HVAC vendor of Target, Fazio's Mechanical Services.
And so there's a whole, you part of a supply chain for somebody else, and that somebody else is the target, but that doesn't stop you being compromised. That doesn't stop your intellectual property being ripped out as well. We may as well while we're here. So
True story.
Every organization needs to think about that. And I was looking...
Andrea, continue.
I was putting a deck together about legal risk, risk in legal firms, and as part of that, that there's access being sold to a law firm that's only got 36 computers. So it's a really small little law firm, but that's being sold on the dark web for a couple of $1,000s. So it doesn't matter the size. You've got something of value to somebody, whether that's the trust that you have or the influence that you have or the intellectual property you hold. It's always something they can find.
I think touching the first point, which we mentioned, that the barrier to enter the cybercrime world, it did get lower, right, over the past years. And obviously the dark web monitoring became one of the pillars of the basic cyber hygiene. It's no longer just for oil companies or government or SCADA professionals. It becomes widespread. So it's kind of the case where if you don't monitor it, you will never know if something happened.
Yeah.
If you are monitoring it and nothing happened, again, back to my point. As you mentioned, credentials. As you mentioned, credentials is one of the most actionable pieces of intelligence, right? Bad IPs, bad domains, credential. In an ideal world, you should strive to the level that to zero trust, or so it doesn't affect you, right? If my login password gets stolen, there was like 2FA and 3FA, or zero trust, so it shouldn't be affecting you. But unfortunately, most companies still, I think 90%, there's still issues with the logins, with the passwords, with the lack of 2FA, with the lack of any kind of a logging of unusual locations, or this time travel, and so on. So I believe nowadays it's just part of the basic cyber hygiene monitor for these things.
Agreed.
Because everyone does it. It's no longer those very focused advanced threat groups or some sophisticated hackers. It can be a 14-year-old kid who just feels that he wants to play hacker.
Teapot was 14, right? If you remember, in Great Britain, Teapot was 14 and a hacker in that regard. The other thing I'd put as a story or as an analogy for this for people is, if you've ever coached football or American football, or if you've ever coached against any other professional or non-professional team, you go scout the team, right? You know how they're going to play. You understand their strengths, their weaknesses. You know what they're going to do. Why would you not want to know about the team attacking you? Like, why would you not want the intelligence? Not monitoring dark web and threat intelligence is saying, I don't need to know about the other team. We're so good. I don't care if somebody has creds for me. I don't care if there's a threat actor targeting my segment. And that, I think, is ignorant. And you would think it ignorant if a coach said that. Yeah. I mean,
and at the same time, we have so many real life examples happening pretty much on a weekly basis from major breaches. So at least that we can take that as a learning curve as well. And a lot of those originate because of breached passwords or credential stuffing attack of some sort. And I mean, even the damage to the reputation of the company. So sometimes I mean, a good example could be 23andMe. And obviously, there are millions of accounts were stolen, right? But then the reputational damage to the company was so insane where their stock price dropped to pretty much pennies, right? And even though, yeah, valuable information, customer data has been accessed, but reputation was immersive. And I think also, Vladimir, you brought up a great point here as well. I talk about it a lot as well. And probably not a single webinar or seminar goes without a mention of AI, right? And here, that's what we're kind of leaning towards into as well, with the development of GPT tools, AI tools. With that going over the roof now, the entry barrier for hackers is so little, so minimal, that even someone like myself that doesn't really understand dark web could literally go utilize the tools and start attacking the companies.
Yeah, I think another implication of AI is that if we talk about the access brokers, could get the access to some CSM management service, which has the network integrations with thousands of clients worldwide. Then with the AI potential of those more advanced threat groups, they're going to be able to analyze and process the data instead of spending years or months. So any automation, it will escalate the cyber warfare at every stage. Because first of all, it's a barrier, then it just makes things more fast-paced.
Yeah, scaling up spear phishing emails is the bit I'm particularly worried about, because that's a primary attack surface anyway. So, but now being able to personalize it and scale it up and speed it up. So
look at response rates, make change based on that response rate, based on the feedback engine that could play into that could get very effective.
And the quality control they can put in place as well. So now I can actually make sure it's grammatically perfect and it's compelling language to make it so people react.
Linguistically appropriate based on region. All kinds of things.
Local language. They're pulling in local.
I could use an S for localization instead of a Z, right? Like I could do all kinds of things like that.
And phishing. Let's take phishing. Phishing. Right now, it's just exponential growth, right? And phishing, with the deep fakes, you can impersonate any voice. You can spoof any number in many countries, right? There is no alternative to meth registers, whitelisting like SID even. And I think the phishing is even worse in this. Like phishing, it's kind of a well-defined area, well-defined controls, but with phishing, good luck trying to take handle of it.
It's a nightmare, isn't it? And all that sort of video deep fake as well. We saw that incident recently with that guy. About
$6 million. Yeah.
$25 million one as well.
$25 million, that's right.
It's ridiculous. So, and there's no real technical controls out there right now to help organizations with this. So it does come back to what we were talking about earlier about the importance of training and education of people and inoculating them and getting them to be aware of the threat cases that could happen. So just making them aware that phishing is really a big threat at the moment. And if they receive a phone call from the boss, it may not be the boss. And you start to have to require process controls and education controls rather than technical ones. And that's something we all need to focus on going forward, really, rather than just like, can we buy another firewall? Is that going to fix this? Because it just isn't.
Absolutely. And we actually just got interesting question as well, which I was curious to ask also around... is there any new law enforcement actions that might change how the dark web operates? So basically legislations coming from governments. And I think it's a slippery slope, right? In theory, the legislation is coming up to control that, but to what effect? Now, we saw GDPR and a lot of things that are being introduced over the last years, but is there anything that we are aware of that's coming out? And is there any positive effect potentially you might have on monitoring dark web?
I think it's not just for modeling dark web. I know that one of the challenges which is in UK is the prosecution of the minors. Because nowadays we have those 14, 15, 16-year-old doing massive breaches, making use, and the legislation is a bit outdated that you barely can do anything, and you just allow it to keep it going. So it's a slippery slope, right? Because you don't want to make it to 10, you don't want to make it this and that, and I think that's one of the challenges which is being debated right now, and how it can be adopted so to prevent them from hacking and get them on the right track. Meanwhile, hardening these things a bit. But in terms of dark web, why haven't we monitored the dark web? Because some registers, the messenger ecosystems do allow those on-the-flow channels to exist. They don't take them down. They don't spend budget on taking it down. Even let's take general social media. There is so much scam on famous social media platforms, and there is not enough investment to tackle it. And still, like as again working for my current company, we see that it's hotbed in many cases.
Yeah.
Many scams just coming from this fake advert. Yeah, exactly. So it all comes from the regulation. So if everyone would do their job properly, there'd be no need to monitor the dark web. Because in order to get this data, it would take someone months to intervene in this criminal group, get trust. It's not that easy to buy a gun in the UK, right? So it would be about the same style. Well, nowadays, it just few clicks.
And I'll speak to the heart of this question, which is, are there any new law enforcement actions that might change the dark web? E.g., as an example, the recent Lockbit takedown and several other coordinated Interpol takedowns of infrastructure and money. And does it make a difference? At the United States border in Texas, I think they find pounds or kilograms and kilograms of drugs are worth millions and millions of dollars, and they seized them. And yet more drugs continue, and yet more things continue. I don't think these takedowns are doing anything other than making a statement to the actor groups that their OPSEC had failed, that they have things that can be taken from them. But you saw with Lockbit 3.0, within 3 days, Lockbit already had new infrastructure. They already brought back the old data, and they actually made a joke to the FBI of saying, hey, we had backups, dummy. These were ephemeral systems. You're nothing. Like, we know. In fact, we operate better than the companies we steal from. Right. And they were able to show that. They have a bug bounty program where Lockbit will pay you $1 million if you find a flaw in their software. Right. I just want to make sure that sinks in. How many of your companies have $1 million flaw in your software bug bounty? I'm being a little hyperbolous, maybe to trigger Andrew, but ultimately, I don't know that these make a difference. However, they are making a statement that there is repercussion, that money can be taken back, that it is traceable, that we are seeing these things. And I do like that in my mind. So that's my thoughts.
I sort of think it's not actually targeting the infrastructure and the providers, actually. I think it's more of a warning shot across the bows at the consumers of those services, because those apps aren't as professional. And every time this, the service has to move on to another
like the hosters, the hardened hosters, yeah.
So every time you're going to lose a percentage of people who just go, this is too risky for me, I don't want to be part of this anymore, I'm going to step away. And so I think every time they're sort of cutting a proportion of people away from it. The problem is that those people are probably immediately replaced by other new kids coming in who go, hey, this looks profitable. And
I'll host on this old data center I can't sell anymore. Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
Yeah, so
I think it's teaching cyber ethics.
Interesting.
Yeah, again, you need to invest more in this new generation existing to actually make people understand what is wrong to do in cyber. For example, it's wrong for us to go to the grocery store and take a can of Coke and just run away. But most don't understand that it's not okay to go to some Telegram channel, download these credentials from some stolen code, log in and watch something for free. So the lack of the cyber ethics messaging, that's what drives it a lot. It can be even, people might not be aware that they're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
It might be just careless infantilism.
I feel like pioneers in this, and I think it's just a lot of things going to change over the years. So I do know that we only have 10 minutes left. So I would say perhaps we can move to some recommendations to the listeners, to the security leaders. What would be recommending? Obviously, we covered some as well. We talked about careers, we talked about different things. But is there any fundamental best practice leaders could take away that they could prioritize in order to kind of secure the business information and track dark web?
Follow a framework, right? Everything we're talking about here is part of a CIS safeguard. Everything we're talking about here is part of basic data hygienic and governance aspects. And so when we're getting into this, like, yes, is there some actionable tactical evidence or tactical suggestions I could give? Yeah, monitor dark web. But that means you then have to know what to do with it. That means you then have to understand its implications. You have to understand the data, how much it's worth, what my risk profile is, like Vladimir said and Andrew said. So those are all things that we're taking for granted. Like, companies need to put on their big boy and big girl shorts and start doing the actions. It goes back to even Vladimir's point of like investing enough in security and hygiene and cyber. A lot of these things are not the company's foremost thought. And Alyssa Miller says it really well. She said, we're told as CISOs our whole lives that the language of business is risk. She said, BS, the language of business is profit, raw, unadulterated profit. We simply translate risk. And unfortunately, when I started my business, I own all the risk the minute I start. So all you're really selling me is reducing risk I've already accepted for the profit I'm making. And that's a real challenge. And so I think the takeaway would be try to live as close to a framework as you can, empower your employees to do it. And as you go down that path, it'll go back to Andrew's point of, I knew I had to have threat monitoring, but I couldn't quantify why. I didn't have a metric. You'll start getting into those quantifiable associations where it plays into those safeguards in my mind. Same thing with AI, same thing with all these concepts we're talking about can be illustrated in the lens of the cyber defense matrix or CIS or CAF or whatever methodology you're wanting to put it in, NCSC to some extent and some of their stuff. But yeah, that'd be my thoughts. Follow a framework.
Matt, who was that quote by again? Sorry, that was a really interesting quote.
Alyssa Miller, Alyssa Miller.
Yeah, I'm going to pick that up again because that's interesting.
Yeah.
What about when, let's say, the breach has happened? Obviously, a lot of times we talked about it, right?
The incident has happened. We don't know if it's a breach.
Exactly.
Let's say it's an incident.
Okay, my mistake. Let's say an incident has happened. What would be the key steps for the organization in order to respond, the crisis management? What would be the advice there?
Andrew?
Why do you keep on asking me these questions that have like
I know, I'm a terrible human. It might be by design.
There's a whole incident response process you've got to go through, which is like massive.
Yeah, like, what do I do?
Depends on your organization, depends on the scenario, depends on the property, the intellectual property that's been stolen. But you have to protect the safety is the first thing you have to do. Are you running a safety critical system? Is this a safety implicating issue? So you do have to, in my case.
I hear the air traffic controller coming out in you again in this statement. So yes.
So safety first. You have to. You can't kill people.
Yeah.
That's the worst thing to do for your business. Yes. So safety first, and then it's how can I protect my staff? How can I protect my customers? And then how do you protect your business after that? But there's so many things you have to think about and rehearse and practice all the way through that to be good at that incident response and the incident.
And my takeaway would be if you don't have an IR plan right now and you're listening to this, that's the takeaway. Andrew, I actually, so I do this all over the world and I ask, do you have an IR plan? And most MSPs, most small to mid-sized businesses do not, right? Like 99% do not. What's funny is I was talking in front of your former ilk, actually one of the MasterCard CISOs was there, but I was speaking at a function of 120 global CISOs in the Fortune 100, Fortune 500 space. And I asked them, I was like, how many of you have an incident response plan that you have tested inside your organization to at least some extent in the last year? And I was like, everybody raised their hand and I was like, I needed that. I just wanted you to know I needed that because everywhere else I do this, 99 don't raise their hand out of 100. Anyways, so if you're hearing this and you don't have an incident response plan, work on it. Yeah, go ahead, Vladimir.
I think incident response plans needs to be valid for the up-to-date threats. One of my favorite questions, do you have an incident response plan if there is a user account compromised and someone is scraping your internal systems? Like it happened with the FBI internal portal and with some other, None of the companies have the anti-scraping protection for the internal systems, but we have an incident response plan for some APT groups, for accidental misconfiguration, all these or that, but you don't have it for that. In terms of the general incident response, my advice would be involve legal as early as possible.
And Vladimir, incident response plan, how often should a company look to review that?
Every year would be more or less sufficient. I can go hardcore, but I would say to find a work and life balance. Once a year is better than once in 4 years or something. So it's a good starting point.
You know what's great about that? You don't have to ask that question if you're following a framework because it's already stated in this. Review annually or when significant enterprise changes occur that could impact this safeguard, 17.1. So that's the other point of this. We as practitioners have to stop shooting from our hips on these things and come to a common set of standards we follow. And then as those need to change them. I guess that's my argument is the safeguards help solve that for you and give you that answer.
I really like the concept of security being a healthcare provider.
Yeah.
So that's how it should be. Yeah.
I'm going to change the tone here. Sorry, guys. We only have a couple of minutes, but I do want to address last interesting question, and I think this could be an interesting way to finish it up. So we have a question asking to share the most memorable dark web-related story from your career. So maybe anyone has interesting story to tell?
I got a quick one. I got a stupid quick one. My CEO showed up with credentials from a leaked porn site and having to deal with that as a young, help desk technician reviewing the creds coming in to go, hey, CEO, I have a set of credentials. That's what you use on everything. Okay, we got this from your porn site that got compromised. You might want to go change those creds on browsers. Like it was quite embarrassing. Yeah, so that was my most memorable one, I think.
And you, Vladimir, any interesting stories?
I think I've told all of mine. The staff member being founded, that sort of the Ashley Madison type one, the threat intel getting through about my company about to be attacked or my industry about to be attacked. Those are the sort of the ones that stick out in my memory, really. Those are the major times that dark web.
I feel like Vladimir has one at least, but he's probably considering now if he should tell one or not.
Yeah, I'm considering it sound ND or not. But generally, I would say, well, when you're thinking about the third-party risk and supply chain security, sometimes fourth-party risk does also exist. And if you do the correct intelligence collection and channel you establish these data pipelines, and sometimes you might detect the contractor of some third party being compromised, and then you tell these third party, hey guys, this happened. They say, oh my God. And then you're thinking, yes, it works. We'll collect the right thing from the right places. And not necessarily needs to be dark web, right? It can be other bits. So I would say fourth party risk is also a big question, especially with a number of companies which do outsource some of their activities to some other countries, which has its own specialties.
I'll add one more. A friend of mine, Britton White, if you don't follow him on LinkedIn, he's a great follow. He does credential harvesting and buys these credentials on the dark web, and then he uses them to validate and find those humans and let them know, right? So he digs into their password vaults, figures out who they are, and reaches out. And one of the funniest stories is he reaches out on private as much as possible so that he doesn't put people on blast. But he had a post about 3 months ago, and it was a text conversation with a CISO. And he had reached out to this CISO and said, hey, listen, here's creds. I've got them. They were harvested from your computer 4 days ago. This is the stuff. Here's the information. And the guy goes, do you not see the S in my CISO title? I don't need your help. And he just do you not see the S? And he's like, bloke, I'm sitting here on your passwords from 3 days ago. I've got your dog's puppy picture. Like, I'm just trying to help you understand. And this guy blew him off. And so he put him on blast. And anyways, but my point is, if you get contacted by somebody like a Vladimir that is saying, I've found something, I think you need to deal with it, have a little humility, be cautious that they're not trying to steal from you or sell to you, but understand that maybe it's worth investigating that information point and taking that with a grain of salt. So
just say fake news.
Yeah, there you go. Fake news. Not true. Fake news. Done. Solved.
Fake news. It's fake news.
Right.
Fake news.
I know we just ran out of time. I really, really appreciate everyone tuning in. And obviously, Andrew, Vladimir, Matt, it's been a pleasure catching up with you guys and talking dark web, cybersecurity. I hope we get to do this again. It's sadly, time flew by, and I think we could keep on talking about this. Anyone listening in, feel free to reach out to any single one of us on LinkedIn, have a chat, talk about cybersecurity. And of course, if you got any further questions around cybersecurity challenges, reach out to Nord Security on nordsecurity.com/business or on LinkedIn. And just interesting thing is, we talked a lot about cyber threat protection and dark web monitoring and so on. We do have Nord Stellar tool coming out that's going to be very interesting for CISOs to explore, especially. So,
wait, y'all got a tool coming out that does dark web monitoring? I had no idea. That's wild, Gerald. No, I tease. See.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Gerald. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Ed.
Yeah. Cheers, guys. Have a good day.